We're here with Guy Horton, who recently returned from northern Kachin state around the conflict areas. Thank you for coming by.
Thanks for inviting me.
Now, while you were there, you spent a lot of time interviewing IDPs who've been exposed to sustained conflict for about a year and a half now. Tell me a little bit about what you saw and experienced while you were there.
Well, where I was based, I was in earshot of fairly continual heavy artillery fire and heavy mortar fire, and it was gradually getting closer. So there was a sense of panic, controlled panic, I suppose I should say, in the area where I was. But people were expecting the worst, and the churches were open, I noticed, 24 hours a day. People were praying for protection, for deliverance, and civilians were quietly preparing to fight. Which is why I'm particularly concerned that there may be some disastrous humanitarian disaster at the end of all this.
Now, when you say civilians were preparing to fight, were they actually arming themselves, or was the Kachin Independence Army arming them? What was happening?
I didn't see them. They were going to places where there were weapons, or where they were being taught how to use weapons and fire and shoot, including women.
Now, this news comes as one of the final hill stations around Laiza reportedly fell this weekend, which kind of opens the way to the rebel stronghold from the Burmese army. What are the possible scenarios? What are people thinking on the ground as far as with regards to this latest development?
Yeah. There's two possibilities here. One, that there will be a full frontal assault on Laiza, and it is the KIA headquarters. And if that happens, the town of Laiza will fight back, the civilians will fight back. And what I'm really afraid of and concerned about is there may be some kind of bloodbath, in fact. And this is quite different fighting from any kind of fighting I've seen in Burma before. This is not low-intensity guerrilla activity. This is not the Saffron Revolution, it's not 1988. It's very heavy, intense military assault. And so this is difficult to convey to people. This is a war with trenches and bunkers, etc. And it is possible that a full-scale assault will take place on Laiza, and the effects on the civilian population will be catastrophic. And the civilians know they have nowhere to flee. That's the problem. They're trapped against the Chinese border, and they have nowhere to flee. In other words, they have no alternative paths but to fight. On the other hand, to answer your question, it may be the intention of the Burma army simply to surround the city, dominate it, control it, and cut it off from the rest of Kachin state, quietly to destroy it. We don't quite know. But how it behaves depends on the international community's response to what's going on. And if that response is sufficiently critical, sufficiently challenging, sufficiently confronting, the Burma army in that area may be actually afraid to go too far. So that is what I think we should be trying to do.
Now, with regards to that, where does China factor in this?
China could well play a really positive role here. I say could, because the areas that we're talking about in northern Kachin state are adjacent to China. And China does not want a war on its doorstep, and it does not want hundreds of thousands of refugees flowing into China. So it's very much in China's interest, and it's said this several times, that it wants a ceasefire, it wants a cessation of the hostilities. So in fact its position is similar to the EU, its position is similar to the UN, its position is similar to the US. There could well be, if they act quickly, a kind of united front from China, the EU, the UN and the US to impose a solution which would be a ceasefire and hopefully a long-term peaceful settlement.
From my understanding, you heard some very harrowing accounts of what they've had to deal with in the mix of this fighting. Can you tell me just a little bit about what you saw and what you heard?
Yeah, and in answer to your question, you have to remember that the Kachin are really united. They're not like the Karen divided between KNU and DKBA, or most Shan groups divided. They are very, very, very united. So the civilians will stand with the army, and the army will stand with the civilians. And so that's why I'm very concerned that the civilians themselves may be directly targeted by the Burmese army. And one of the additional reasons why I'm very concerned about it is the stories that I listened to from the civilians who had fled fighting. And they were some of the worst that I've ever heard from Burma. A woman bayoneted to death with a baby of 17 days old, a woman gang raped to death, a man shot in the stomach, then massively mutilated afterwards. I mean, things that one doesn't really want to talk about, but these were the worst kind of stories I've heard in Burma. So my fear is this could be replicated against the civilian population.
Right.
And I think something that needs to be borne in mind is that we're not just here talking about Laiza, we're talking about a corridor, maybe 5, 6, 7, 3 miles long for hundreds of miles, in which there are hundreds of thousands, in the low hundreds of thousands, of civilians trapped between the Burma Army and China. So
right.
it's this entire civilian population which is really under threat.
Now these stories run kind of counter to the narrative that's been built around Burma in the last couple of years as it's begun to open up. What does the military's behavior say about the legitimacy of these reforms in your mind from what you've seen in the last week?
Well, they put a very, very severe question mark over these reforms. Mm-hmm. And remember, what I witnessed is massive warfare. Mm-hmm. You know, artillery, helicopters, jet bombers, mm-hmm. Massive human wave attacks. This is extremely systematic onslaught mm-hmm. on the Kachin people. And how can the international community possibly be engaging in a liberalization reform process while this is going on? It doesn't really make any sense, and it puts a huge question mark over the whole reform process.